Hey, it's me, Big P, and I wanted to go over my cast on crit Exsanguinate Inquisitor before I make any kind of crazy big investments. I kind of like where the gear is right now in terms of recommending the build as a starter. I was able to swap from whatever my initial plans were into this with a pretty generic spell crit tree as usual, and the Inquisitor can do a lot of things. There's a couple things you kind of have to tweak to get the cast on crit and the cyclone working properly, but it's nothing too crazy, and my gear is pretty basic, with kind of rares I found on the first or second day, filling up the slots that aren't filled by uniques. And we'll go over the gear and the skills and how you can maybe get yourself started if you're looking to roll a second build on the second week or something like that. I will say that there's a lot of ways to do Exsanguinate. It's kind of a weird skill to scale in terms of damage. That's kind of why I liked going the cast on crit Inquisitor route, because things like cast speed and maybe scaling like damage over time aren't huge things in that. But cast speed doesn't affect us really at all, our damage. So I'm gonna run the highest tier map I currently have, and I'll just go over the build as we're going through it. I'm doing a more open map so that we kind of get an idea of how the clear looks like without chain. I do not run chain in main links. That's probably mostly because I'm scaling the initial hit damage as well as the dot damage, because there's a couple way to scale damage. I think I'll go over that when we go over the tree. But yeah, this is the highest tier map I have right now. Map sustain's been a little slow, and I took a couple days off to rest my wrists. So let's get into it. Overall, I think it's going to be a little bit tricky to scale further in to red maps and deep into the end game. But it's a very satisfying and interesting sort of way to leverage one of the new skills in kind of a classic way. You know, like, who doesn't love a good cast on crit character? And I particularly like ones that don't really necessitate buying something like a Cosprey's Malice, which I might admittedly end up respecing this into. If not just because it would probably be really good for the league mechanic. I'm going to run to the boss right here and kind of just to showcase the damage a bit. It's Maven. So we pop your Arcanist brand, which does Blade Blast and cast your vulnerability. And then your Corrupting Blood. I don't even have my flasks up, and I actually didn't even have whatchamacallit. Yeah, my Diamond Flask, which for a cast on crit build, critting on your attack is everything. We'll get into that when we go over the gear, because there's some things that you might need to tweak, or maybe just look to kind of get first if you want to start this from the ground up, which is very possible to do. I kind of went for cast on crit because I was kind of just messing around with Exsanguinate as a skill while I was leveling, and it felt great. It felt like it had a lot of damage, and I wanted to kind of see how I could make it work for an Inquisitor, despite not being the most obvious sort of thing that there's a lot of other versions of this build, and like I said before, there's a lot of ways to scale damage with it. There's a couple interesting ways. So Exsanguinate is a physical spell, kind of like Blade Vortex and Blade Blast, that sort of thing, but it doesn't scale in exactly the same way. And there's actually a couple of things that I've bounced between whether or not I want to scale the initial hit, critical strike multiplier, that sort of thing. I'm gonna try and do this with no towers. I like doing them with no towers if I can. And then we're gonna do the ultimatum. But yeah, without chain, you do have to get up close and personal. I think when I go over the main links of Exsanguinate, I'll kind of explain exactly why. I don't personally like chains. Like I said before, I'm scaling the initial hit, but as well, if you're clearing a bunch of packs, you won't have anything to hit with your cyclone when you're doing a cast on crit. So chain, although it does help with coverage, and coverage can help with survivability. Nice oil. For example, on like an open map like this, you see a lot of stragglers like this. I think an Explodey chest might help the build even after the nerfs. would probably still be good
Random
enough.
chance must dictate
And
you
of
win.
course,
Slay
another reason I
them
went cast
amongst
on
the
crit was
flames.
that kiting monsters around in the ultimatum is very, very important. I guess I also want to mention I keep my Exsanguinate down here in the corner so I can see how often it's proccing, how consistent it's proccing. That's because of the links. I'm using controlled destruction in the links right now, so take a look for yourself if you want to see how consistent the
Vengeance is
Inquisitor's
cold
crit is with it.
indeed.
I'm not sure why people kind of only do assassin, well maybe not only, but are kind of more inclined to do an assassin as a cast on crit. I mean, I know why, because assassin is the crit ascendancy, but even with something like control destruction in your main links that is affecting the cyclone, it's very
Death's cold
possible to
grip
get
is
a
inescapable.
pretty consistent, I mean, and I'll also talk about how this might be a little bit different than, you end up wanting to spam the Exsanguinate despite the dot portion of it only having three stacks
Hate
max. But
begets
that's fine
hate.
because you don't really need to think about it that much on a cast on crit. That's kind of why it feels really nice. Ooh, take a big hit there. So we do want to proc the Arcane Surge every once in a while with the Flame
Strains
Dash.
away all hope.
And also just to kind of jump on a rare that's maybe spitting projectiles from, from the side. Hopefully we'll be able to do this all the way. That would be nice.
Can you feel death coiling around your heart?
Also, I'm sure it's no secret by now, a lot of people are using Arcanus Brand for their utility spells. I think especially in a super clusterfuck league like Ultimatum, something like Arcanus Brand, which cannot die and will actually kind of move around and help tag a bunch of people with the spells you want. Arcanus Brand is really the way to go. And it's also worth noting that we're using Corrupting Fever as well. But I think that's about it for the map. I think I don't want this video to be super long. It's already kind of getting there. But I'm going to go over the gear really quick and the tree as well because I haven't really pushed the build with anything crazy like timeless jewels or niche cluster jewels, things like that. I have a very basic tree that you can follow and get into if you want to take a look at the skill and you like what you see. So that's what, tier 13. That was tier 13 rare, nothing too crazy on it, but let's get right into, I guess we'll go over the skills first. And the first one is going to be cast on crit and Exsanguinate. So Exsanguinate, dealing physical damage on its initial hit, and then a physical damage dot damage over time. The physical damage dot cannot be converted. There's a lot of ways I might actually end up converting with like late game, like two-handed weapon sort of stuff to sort of leverage Battle Mage a bit more because it's kind of dinky with the Cold Iron Point, although Cold Iron Point is probably best in slot for a large majority of the builds and ours too at this current point as well. Something interesting about Exsanguinate is that modifiers to spell damage apply to this skill's damage over time effect. And so what I kind of looked for when I looked for gems to support it were ones that would affect both the initial spell damage and the dot that's done from the Exsanguinate. It does say it's a narrow, sort of tendrils that come out when the it's almost hard to see you because it's a very understated sort of spell. It's not very flashy like a Frostbolt or like an Ice Nova or something. So it's kind of tricky to tell exactly where you're doing damage, and it is a very narrow cone that comes out in a direction from your character. It's kind of hard to tell when you're proccing, like 5 of them a second. But it is sort of, there are some dead zones, something that's come up, but I think Reap had even worse dead zones, so I kind of liked Exsanguinate. If not just because Reap, I tried a Reap version of the build for a little bit, but you would have to self-cast a Reap to get the blood charges, and even then the blood charges would, like, if you kill something with it, then you lose it. It was just all too much. Exsanguinate is nice because, although you might think initially that you'll need to, like, balance, 3 dots on, like, if you're trying to do single target, it doesn't really end up being that way because you're doing a lot of damage with the initial hit anyway, and I believe you reapply the debuff that does the secondary dot portion of the damage when you hit it. So I mean, it's, you just throw a cast on crit in it, and you're doing a lot of damage. Second that with the corrupting fever, that you're definitely making a bunch of stacks on. Kind of way better than a lot of other builds might be, because Cyclone is hitting a lot, and your spell is hitting a lot as well. So I mean, in terms of hits per second, it's probably upwards of like 10, if not at least 10. 10 is like the minimum if you're like not hitting. But anyway, let's go over the link. So it's Exsanguinate, Cyclone, cast on crit. So you're not really able to scale that much damage because you're using a lot for the Cyclone itself, which doesn't really matter. You can get the one that has, I think Divergent has increased move speed. And then the cast on crit does increase spell crit strike chance, which is pretty nice. Brutality, the physical damage, is one of the ones you want to look out for, both here in your links and on the tree, because that will scale both the initial hit and the damage over time. Of course, you're dealing no elemental damage with this, so leveraging any other sort of, I was thinking maybe Herald of Ash, and this build might eventually become something like that, but for right now, Brutality, this would be the 4-link. Unless maybe Efficacy is actually better. I'm not sure. I go back and forth between things like Efficacy and I used Life Tap for a bit to kind of keep the Corrupting Fever up before I was more comfortable with my regen and how we were going. But Efficacy and Brutality, this would be a 5-link, I would say. And then your 6th link would be increase critical strike until you're comfortable enough with your crit to get Controlled Destruction. Controlled Destruction is just really kind of crazy in terms of more spell damage applying to, again, both the initial hit and the dot. Very powerful. So let's go into the Corrupting Fever right quick. Ideally, this would be in, I think it's Essence, one of those dang essences that have socketed gems deal more Fizz multi, but I've been very lazy about these 3 rares particularly. I found this on the first day, crafted this on the first day, and I think I dropped this from an ultimatum on the second. The lab enchant isn't necessary at all. I've actually bounced around between using my auras here, Vitality, and Herald of Purity. If you are going to use Vitality, you might need to go into some level of reduced reservation on the tree here, but that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Corrupting Fever is very simple. It's a 4-link, unless you want it to be a 1-link, because when you cast it, depending on how many, so with that, everything in, it still costs a decent bit of damage if you're not an Inquisitor. I mean, you don't want to keep it on the left click, even though it's an instant cast sort of thing. It will kill you. So you kind of just pop that before you DPS into some rares. It's a little nerve-wracking, but it actually, you pop it and then your life flask can kind of make up the difference within about a second if you pop that. Just another flask to press, just another day in Path of Exile. What else do we got? So let's go over the Arcanist brand. So the main skill, and these are the 2 sub skills, I would say. You pop your Corrupting Blood and maybe throw an Arcanist brand down or 2. The Arcanist brand is casting Blade Blast that is linked with Power Charge on critical, which works to give you power charges. This isn't really necessary even with Controlled Destruction and links. However, if you're going from the ground up and you want to keep that crit more consistent, particularly if you're trying to do cast on crit before you get Righteous Providence, it's gonna be nice. And then Vulnerability is just Vulnerability. Ideally, we'll get it on a ring somewhere, or maybe as a Corrupted Implicit on some gloves. But for right now, it's actually boosted by the Cold Iron Point, which we'll get to when we go over the gear. So it's pretty nice. Yeah, just a nice little bit of utility. So my guard skill is Molten Shell. Just a little bit of armor because we don't really have that much in total. I am using a Granite Flask, which kicks it up a bit, but it's still not it's not nearly as tanky as I want it to be overall. We're just under 6k life, but that's without any life on our ring slots because I've just kind of picked up an early Thief's Torment to fix some resistances and haven't felt really compelled to replace it since. If not only because I'm not sure what I really want to invest in terms of rings, might be Circle of Guilt or something like that, but that's getting more into the gear. Cast when damage taken, Molten Shell, and Blood Rage is very nice. I initially thought that Blood Rage was kind of like, maybe a bit too much, maybe a bit overkill, but Blood Rage Frenzy charges actually give a lot of damage to the build. These are of course conditional and probably only up while you're mapping, but it's not that bad. And it's definitely something you want to throw into the build. Of course, you could try something else like Frost Shield. Frost Shield I was using early on. but that will eat into your energy shield, although it's not that bad. It definitely saves us against stuff like porcupines and stuff. So yeah, Blood Rage if you want more damage, and Frost Shield if you want more defense. Flame Dash, Arcane Surge, and Second Wind, pretty standard. Worth noting that you can put this maybe in a 4-link with Life Tap if you don't want to keep having to reapply your Corrupting Fever. I was using Life Tap in main links here, but it's a little bit more difficult to kind of keep up the cost, because with Life Tap, your our cost was like 8 or 9 life, and then you pretty much have to be cycloning for the duration for, I think the Corrupting Fever duration is just over 7 seconds, and you have to be cycloning for like 5 of those seconds to proc it. So it ended up actually being a little bit more sloppy than I'd like to. And I kind of liked having the control of knowing exactly, I have it on my middle mouse button, the Corrupting Fever. It's just kind of more consistent for me, but you know, it's a pretty flexible build, honestly, because there's not exactly one thing that you're leveraging in terms of your sub skills here. So you can have more utility slots down here, you can have more auras, you can try the low life stuff. I'm too scared to try it myself, if not just because seeing the life at half just gives me anxiety. And then the auras, Precision is a clutch aura because not only does it bring up critical strike chance, but the accuracy rating gives chance to hit. That's very important. Zealotry as well is relevant not only in terms of scaling spell damage, but also for our ascendancy. I guess I'll go over that when we go over the tree. I'll go over the ascendancy first. And then Herald of Purity linked with Maim to increase physical damage when your enemies are maimed. That's pretty nice. You could replace this with Vitality. You might honestly want to do that early until you feel tanky enough for whatever type of content you're doing. And that's about it for the skills, I believe. So let's go over the tree and the Inquisitor itself real quick. Now, Inquisitor, for a physical damage build, this is actually the second since the rework, second pure physical. Well, the other one was poison, but let's say non-elemental build that I've done with the Inquisitor, and you actually can get a decent bit of leverage, but with things like increased damage taken to enemies on your consecrated ground. That's generic, you know, that's not just applying to elemental, even though all your small nodes say elemental damage, which we're not taking advantage of at all, unfortunately. Things like the increased damage taken will apply to all the damage you're dealing. And you have consecrated ground while you're stationary, and the consecrated ground is amazing with Pious Path. I'm not even really using this to its full potential now, because I'm not using Corrupted Soul yet on the what is it? That Karui jewel, I forget what it's called right now. I didn't want to do the build guide after that. I wanted to do this before, so you have a more realistic sort of way to approach this sort of build, and then kind of tweak it to your own. You know, I haven't got everything figured out, I'm going to say right now. I'm probably going to spend a couple weeks really sort of pushing the build and seeing exactly if it's even really feasible for pure physical style damage to be done on an Inquisitor. But right now it's feeling pretty smooth and fun as we push into reds. So yeah, Pious Path. The effects of Consecrated Ground you create linger for 4 seconds. That's pretty important because I believe this should also count for any Zealotry procs. Zealotry will proc, it gives you a chance on hitting a rare or unique enemy. And I don't know if you've noticed in the ultimatums, there's quite a lot of rare enemies. So it's going to be pretty good for you. This Consecrated Ground, of course, increases critical strike chance. Oh, and I forgot, of course, elemental ailments are not a thing for our build. As long as you're standing still part of the time, you can kind of double back over. So you see in the top left, my Consecrated Ground is gone now as soon as you stop, or if you just kind of stop moving with the Cyclone for just a bit, or Flame Dash, it'll refresh it. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this isn't always going to be up technically, but it virtually will be, especially with just like pretty average playstyle. You kind of don't have to worry about it so much like you would have to like an Instruments of Zeal sort of buff. You know, Pious Path is just kind of there, and these would be the first two. You can maybe go for Righteous Providence before this. You do want Pious Path before you get into maps, and Battle Mage is definitely last, or Instruments of Virtue rather. I just call it Battle Mage because no one really cares about that first one. It's really the second one that matters. And normally Sorry. I initially thought that Battle Mage wouldn't really do that much for our build, but something nice about Exsanguinate, which I think that a lot of the builds that are kind of only focusing on the dot are kind of missing out on, is the effectiveness of added damage. So even though the Cold Iron point that we're using doesn't have a lot of flat damage on it, it does add a decent chunk to that initial hit. Let's actually see how much. So 32k to 50k. And that goes to, it's almost 9k on the initial hit. Yeah, I don't know. It's pretty good. I mean, oh, well, I guess it's kind of hard to tell because it also brings the level down. Never mind. Don't. it's hard to tell. So the Cold Iron point. Let me go into the tree really quick just so we can get it over with. So Inquisitor starts in a spot that's actually really nice. You get the wheels here of these new physical damage. I don't know if Vanquisher is new, but don't do what I did and wait until like you're almost level 90 to get this wheel. Physical damage is really good for the build. An overwhelming physical damage reduction is kind of only in X amount of places in the game available to us as players. Crush is something that's really good. Crush enemies for 4 seconds when you hit them when they are on full life. So you kind of want to be able to DPS something down within the 4 seconds because of this. Otherwise, they kind of gain back 15% physical damage reduction. It's a little tricky. I guess before we get into the tree, it's worth noting that there's 3 main ways that I looked at to scale damage. Maybe 4 if you count the damage over time nodes that I've kind of eked into over here. Just because we are using a lot of damage over time, you can't completely ignore it. But the ones you really want to focus on are things like, well, Fizz.multi is fantastic, but just the generic physical damage here and here. Strength only applies to, unfortunately, melee physical damage instead of just generic physical damage. Be amazing if we could somehow get this to work for the spell that we're proccing, but c'est la vie. Conqueror's efficiency doesn't even matter. I was just having this. This was left over from the spell slinger. I'm actually using pretty much no jewels right now. I'd probably spec out of some life here or there, or maybe some of the weaker, more iffy damage clusters that I've gone into to go into this cluster jewel setup here, but I'm getting kind of lazy about it, and I don't really know exactly what I would search for anyway. Sanctuary is good just because we're using a shield right now. You can go for 2 gold iron points if they're not too expensive, but you will obviously sacrifice a lot of defense, and because we don't really have the benefit of being a range, we're pretty much a melee attack build that's using what I would consider kind of a melee spell, especially if you're not using chain in your main links. Which brings me to, actually, I forgot to mention, if you want to use chain in the main links, that's totally fine. I just didn't really want to cut the damage from our initial hit that much. And then you can swap into Swift Affliction if you don't want to change the color. I mean, I assume you don't want to change the color every time you gem swap on your build. Swift Affliction would be your single target damage because chain really is for the clear, which you can really get away with. I mean, Exsanguinate does have a lot of damage, and any build that's scaling the damage properly can definitely get away with it. But yeah, the tree, it's a little scuffed for my purposes. Going up here, I thought it was going to be an Unleash and stuff, and it ends up actually being better because of the way Righteous Providence works with increasing your crit based on whichever of strength or int is lower. So my int without these nodes would be kind of low, or at least slightly lower. It ends up not really mattering, honestly, after a certain point. Stuff like the Astromentus almost feels like overkill until you consider the fact that Dex is important for a number of reasons. We'll go over that when we go over the gear, but yeah, the tree is nothing too fancy. It's pretty generic. I mean, the only real things is being able to dip down here. We'd probably put our last couple points here. Depends on what you really want to do. Things like precision are nice to have because movement speed is good on Cyclone, and dexterity and global accuracy rating are also nice because you really need that Cyclone to be as close to 100% chance to hit as you can get it, be it whether you have a bunch of dex or accuracy rating on the tree. We've even gone into depth perception here, if not just because Master Force is, again, so fantastic for our build. Overwhelm physical damage reduction and increased physical damage. Yeah, but anyway, I didn't mention the 3 sorts of damage. Increased physical damage generic will boost our Exsanguinate. Generic spell damage will also boost both parts. And then just generic damage of any sort. The biggest ones would be increased damage taken generically on Sanctuary and our Cyclopean Coil, the last one there. Increased damage per 5 of your lowest attribute, which is Dexterity, which is pretty high because we have an Astromentus and you kind of go into Dex on the tree in parts like this just because nothing else will bring up your damage more at this point. Again, besides investing into like more expensive jewels and stuff like that, but I don't want to do that. I have another one here. And attack damage leeches life is kind of nice. You just kind of, as soon as you get over here, you can kind of decide whether or not you want to go all the way into stuff like depth perception. I would go to Master of Force though if you're doing the straight Fizz. Growth and Decay is whatever. Written in Blood's fantastic. And I initially was trying to scale a lot of crit multi for the spells, going as far as to allocate Heartseeker and stuff like that, going up into Throatseeker as well. But crit multi doesn't actually scale the dots, which are kind of a big portion of our build. It would just be the initial hit. It probably would be a decent bit of damage. I'm again trying to figure out balancing the damage between the different sorts of sources that are there. But anyway, let's get into the gear itself so that we can kind of talk about how the gear is really kind of what you'd invest in to kind of bump your damage up by a certain level here and there. So the first thing I would go for probably is the Cold Iron Point, depending on how expensive they are. Luckily, none of the uniques are actually required for the build. For example, like instead of this, you just replace it with, well, you can't really do a wand with plus level of skull gems if you want to do the Cyclone, but you could self-cast well into maps. I was actually practicing with self-casting through the axe. That's kind of how I fell in love with Exsanguinate. And then in my early maps, I was still self-casting, and there's a lot of merit to self-casting. Unleash just cleanly gets you all 3 stacks at once. It's pretty nice, but ultimately something like Cold Iron Point is going to be best in slot for an overwhelming majority of your time with the build until you can craft something insane or, maybe respec into an elemental conversion mode. Maybe use a Volconus. Volconus is very nice for a lot of physical spells. But we'll see, if that actually ends up being okay because of the weird way that Exsanguinate Fizz Dot works. It might end up being better to ignore it, scaling stuff like Herald of Ash and other elemental stuff, but that's besides the point. I don't want to ramble on too long about stuff like that. Astromentus is very nice. We're not really a stat stacking build. I might go for a Shaper's Touch as well. If I can get a good corrupt on it, just to kind of leverage a bit more although you don't really need it. I think actually the damage over time implicit gloves might be better, or like I said before, those essence crafted ones might be better, but Astromentus is probably what I would look for to really kind of boost your crit and as well as bringing your dex up to kind of get a more respectable chance to hit and a critical strike chance on your Cyclone attack, which will, determine how many times you can actually get your spell out per second. And then finally, I invested in a Cyclopean Coil because the percent increased attributes and the percent increased damage per 5 of your lowest attribute are really good for the build. Attributes will bring up, it also has a nice bit of life on it. Unfortunately, we are already immune to both Frozen and Ignite and Shocked, so you can kind of ignore all 3 of those. Don't worry about those at all. We're only interested in the increased damage per 5 of your lowest attribute and a bunch of life as well as increased attributes. If we take it off, we lose a decent bit of damage, a decent bit of chance to hit. Well, not that bad actually. We do have a nice amount of dex and almost max level precision. Everything else is kind of really flexible. I have +1 to physical spell gems on my shield. This dropped for me and I crafted a resistance I needed on it. Again, you can go for 2 daggers if you want to go a little bit more softcore. The build has started to feel, it's been very tanky through the yellow maps, but now that I'm pushing into reds and have to get like weird corruptions, and have to run those maps with like reduced recovery rate, it's getting a little wonky, but that's fine because we've been using a Thief's Torment this whole time. Which I'm pretty much only using for a little bit of extra oomph in that first week and just a bunch of resistances. And that goes for pretty much every other piece of gear on the build. Again, no relevant jewels besides the Conqueror's Efficiency. That's not really, I guess skill effect duration is kind of nice on our build. Um, and flasks, we have Adrenaline Flask is nice because, well, I mean, it's just a Quicksilver Flask, you know, but especially for a Cyclone build, if the sooner you can move into a pack and hit it and do your damage on it, that's what's up. I didn't really roll this. You don't really have to worry about your flasks that much. Besides the warding flask and the staunching flask, I would get them. These are really kind of suboptimal flasks. I wouldn't follow them, you know. See what your build needs. You can go into... I was going to say it's Zeri's Promise, but unfortunately, no, do not use that because we're using Brutality. You deal no chaos damage either. So it would be kind of bad. I think of what else I can go over. I mean, I'm going to be probably streaming the build for another week or so before maybe re-rolling into other plans I have. But overall, I was pretty happy with the way it has turned out so far. I've pretty much been able to not have to stop any of my Atlas progress even after flipping my gems. I've just been going through it, breezing through it, Mavens all the way up to 5-way, I believe. Very quickly. Again, it's kind of petering off in red maps, but I wanted to get this sort of build guide out so that people could sort of take a look at what I'm doing and compare it to a bunch of other different ways because, again, Exsanguinate is a very sort of complicated skill that we're kind of leveraging in a very simple way. Just spit out a bunch of blood and get that dot over everybody. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun. So if you want to see more of the build or you have more questions, you can either write some in the comments here. You know, I've been getting a lot of nice, you know, just a lot of nice discussion here and on Twitch. You know, if people stop by, I'm going to have my links in the description here. And yeah, let me know if you have any other ideas of builds you want to try or if you've tried Exsanguinate or any of the new physical spells yourself. Because I'd be interested to hear if there's any like super weird niche interactions that I'm overlooking and stuff like that. Oh my god, the build this wasn't supposed to be half an hour long. Well, that's the build guide, I guess. Dang. All right, time to go make a weird thumbnail. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.